quilty friends, it's Carolina Moore, your favorite sewing and quilting YouTuber, and today we're getting a little bit spicy because we're talking about why people hate the Accuquilt machine. You ready? Let's get started. Alright friends, I have my Accuquilt Go Big here, and we're actually going to cut some fabric while we're having this conversation because I figured what goes better than hating on the Accuquilt machine than having the Accuquilt machine give us a little love while we're hanging out. So the first thing I want to mention is that I have been designing patterns for Accuquilt dies for several years, and I'm now an Accuquilt licensed die designer. So if you thought this was going to be a video all about hating on the Accuquilt, then you might want to go elsewhere, because this is going to talk about what people do not like about it, which really is a lot of what they don't understand about it or why it may not necessarily be for them, which is totally okay. All right, we're going to actually cut some fabric while we're hanging out here. So I have my die, my mat, and my Go Big, which is the electric Go. I love the electric Go because it is super fast, and you'll see that here. And it just runs everything right through. It can be a little loud, so we're going to talk over the noise, but that's totally okay. And the die that I have here is the Drunkard's Path die. This is a die that I would hate to cut these blocks out myself. So the first reason that people hate the Accuquilt Go, or the Go Me, or the Go Big, is they say that it wastes fabric. And I'll show you this die right here that we just cut. Let's take a look at the fabric waste that we get on this one. All right, let me move my machine a little bit here so you can see the whole die. I'm going to give this a friction rub, and then we're going to slide the mat off. Okay, so here is the die cut. By the way, it cut through 6 layers of fabric beautifully. There we go. I have these Drunkard Paths blocks all cut. These would have taken me forever to cut, so it's definitely faster. No one's arguing that it's not faster for specialty dies especially, but they're talking about this waste here. So let me move these out of the way so we can see the waste that we are actually talking about. Okay. So down here, I have the selvage. That's what I would have been cutting off anyway. Here, we have the bits of fabric that I would have squared off anyway. And then here, which is actually on the fold of my fabric, I have a big chunk of totally usable fabric. So on this die specifically, not a lot of waste. Now someone might be saying, well, you have a bunch of dies and you picked one where you could show that, hey, there wasn't a lot of waste. Okay, fair enough. I'll totally take your point. I picked this one because I think it's a really fun die that you wouldn't want to have to cut out all these pieces by hand or by template, and doing it by die is so much faster. But yes, for most Accuquilt dies, this is the kind of waste that you'll see. You'll see the edges, which is what you'd be squaring up anyway, and you'll see this extra. I also personally don't love the concept of fabric waste, because what is wasting fabric? When I take a quilt block and I square it up, am I wasting those bits that I'm squaring up? No, they served their purpose. They were there to help me align things as I was sewing, and now I'm bringing the block to square so that the full quilt lays flat. If I don't square it up and throw those pieces away, then I will end up with a lumpy quilt. So I have to get rid of that fabric in order to have a good quilt. No one is calling squaring up wasting fabric, so why are we calling this wasting fabric? Also, I think the waste of fabric is fabric where you spend it to make a quilt. You take all your money to buy the fabric, you take your time to put the quilt together, and at the end, the quilt isn't put together well. It doesn't hold through the wash because you weren't able to put it together right, because you weren't able to cut it right to begin with. So that, to me, is true wasting of fabric. Although even that I have a hard time really saying that's wasting, because if you had a good time making the quilt, then was that really a waste, right? So let's redefine what wasting fabric means. Fabric wasting away on your shelves that you don't get to play with, maybe that's a waste of fabric. And maybe things like squaring up or using fabric to make things and having some that doesn't make it into the finished project, maybe that's not a waste. Also, all of these little bits and pieces go perfect into pillowcases and get turned into dog beds. So it's not like they're a waste. And these bigger chunks on the side, I'll absolutely use these for another project. Okay, so I'm going to go keep, oh, I triggered the machine. Okay, I'm going to keep cutting my fabric as we talk some more about what people don't like about the Accuquilt. The next big thing that I see is they think that, or they don't understand why someone would need it. I am proficient, more than proficient, with a rotary cutter and ruler. I know how to cut out a quilt, and a rotary cutter and ruler is way less expensive. So why on earth would I spend the money on an Accuquilt machine? Because these are expensive machines, and the dies, they're not cheap either, right? So why would you spend all that money? And the answer is because either you find it faster and easier, and so you want that time or work savings, right? Or you have problems with your hands and wrists. Now, I, at a very young age, got tendonitis in my wrists, and it was actually in high school, so super young that I had tendonitis in my wrists, and so my wrists get really, really tired after a lot of cutting, and I can even be in wrist pain for days where I can't really do a lot because of the pain in my wrists. I have to be really careful about the kind of activity that I do and how often that I do it in order to keep my wrists from being in pain while I work. So lots of people have arthritis or vision issues that make it difficult for them to use a rotary cutter and ruler. There are lots of reasons why a rotary cutter and ruler would not be the best option for someone. And if for you a rotary cutter and ruler is the best option, then absolutely use a rotary cutter and ruler. No one's saying that everyone has to go buy an Accuquilt machine, but we're saying that they're available for people who want them, need them, and who have their quilting improved by access to a machine like this. All right, we're going to run another one through. We're going to talk about another thing that people don't like about the Accuquilt machine, and that is it's back to the not understanding of it, and not understanding that it is something that some people need. And I compare that to glasses, right? So I often have readers on my head. I don't right now, I probably should. But I often have readers on my head. When I was a younger quilter, didn't need readers. I could see everything just fine. As my eyes age, I need some accessibility devices like readers. For someone who doesn't need readers to say, you don't need readers, that's just silly. Because, okay, if they don't need readers, don't use them. But if I need them, it should be okay for me to have access to them and use them. The other great accessibility thing about the Accuquilt is that for someone who really still wants to be able to quilt, but for whatever reason truly can't cut, they can have kids, grandkids, a spouse, a friend can come over, and even though that person might not know anything about quilting, they can cut out a quilt on the Accuquilt, and then the quilter can sew it. So a quilter not able to cut anymore can still continue to quilt by having someone else cut out the quilt on the Accuquilt, and they can trust that it's cut out right even though their loved one doesn't know anything about quilting. Speaking of which, when I first made my very first quilt, I cut my finger with a rotary cutter. I was 12 years old and I cut my finger with a rotary cutter. So 20 years later, when I taught, it's actually more than 20 years later, when I taught a kids quilting class, I said, we're going to teach that kids quilting class with the Accuquilt machine. And I brought in my Accuquilt Go. I think we had 3 Accuquilt Go's for a class of, I think it was 19 kids. And the kids were able to cut out their quilts on the Go machine, which was much safer. Nobody cut their finger open on a rotary cutter. It was quick and easy for them to make their quilts. And we didn't have to worry about anyone having to go to the hospital and getting stitches like I did the first time that I made my quilt. So it's also great for younger quilters who are still learning about, you know, sharp tools and being careful. And for parents who maybe don't want their kids to have access yet to big sharp tools like rotary cutters. Okay. And then I do want to talk about one thing that I truly love about the Accuquilt Go, which I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, and that is how fast it is. So I just cut out an entire quilt of Drunkard's Path blocks in the time that we were talking. So these are 2 color blocks. Half of them will have this fun floral print as the outside, and half of them will have it as the curve, and then also this aqua as either the outside or the curve. And I'll be able to stitch these together to make a full Drunkard's Path quilt. And I cut this whole thing in, I mean, I even paused a couple times to stop and chat with you. So it's that fast to cut a specialty block. So for me, as someone who doesn't need it as an accessibility tool, who is proficient with a rotary cutter and ruler, I love the Accuquilt for specialty blocks like the Drunkard's Path, like the double wedding ring. For applique shapes, the gnome die is one of my absolute favorite dies because I love that cute gnome shape, but I'm not spending the time to cut out all those pieces. Instead, I run it through the Accuquilt and boom, I've got a cute gnome that I can applique on anything. I love the applique dies. I love the specialty dies. I love the block on board dies. And I love it for using my scraps. So things like the block on board dies or the half square, quarter square triangle dies, I can throw my scraps on there, run them through the English paper piece and cube, run my scraps through, and now I have hexagons ready to baste and sew made out of my scraps. So I love it for the ease of specific projects. It's not something that I go to first for cutting strips and squares, but I absolutely have strip and square dies because sometimes it is so much easier to just slap the fabric on and have it cut my strips and squares for me rather than me trying to line up the ruler every single time. I get a lot less fabric waste when I'm cutting strips on an Accuquilt strip die because I know that it is cutting those strips accurate every time and I'm not getting wobbly or wonky or mismeasuring and cutting wrong and having to cut again. Alright friends, there you go. If you were someone who wasn't so sure about the Accuquilt or had heard negative things about the Accuquilt, I hope that I've changed your mind. It does not mean that you need to go buy an Accuquilt for yourself. Maybe it's an item that you'll want in the future, and maybe you will never need to touch an Accuquilt or want to touch an Accuquilt, and that's okay. The reality is that tools like this exist for people who want it and need it, and if that's not you, that's okay. But we still want it to exist for the people who want it and need it, people like me. Alright friends, that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and maybe learned a little something along the way. Go ahead and give the video a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, especially comments about how much you love your Accuquilt, leave those down below. And if you're not subscribed to this channel yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button. And friends, I will see you right here real soon. Bye for now.